subway.
Yes, we filmed at a lovely Tudor house just outside London called Chenius for the library with Hester and William. The house that you see the exterior of, the man had lived there for 60 years, and it was actually exactly as it looked. We didn't have to put anything on it except the lamppost. That's all we had to add, because he'd been there for 60 years. He'd moved in as a young man in the attic and fallen in love with a widow's daughter who lived underneath, and gradually they took off the whole house. And when we shot Mrs. Elton's flat in that downstairs apartment and the hallway, we had to build the flat because the upstairs rooms were just simply too small. We did filming in Chancery Lane and Lincoln's Inn, which is, you know, if you ever go to England, go to Lincoln's Inn in Chancery Lane. It's one of the most beautiful, beautiful inns. It's one of the Inns of Court. You have, if you want to be a barrister, you have to study at one of the Inns of Court, and Lincoln's Inn is the most beautiful. The Undercroft. So there were little bits of location, but not a lot. But it just needed to be opened out. I mean, the pub, for instance, this huge pub, which is abandoned now, called Crocker's Folly, and we only used a tiny amount of it, you know, but it was just right. It had the right feel, and the exterior of the pub, when they argue, is in fact a different pub. It's a pub in Holborn, and it's been there since 1584, and every year the Lord Mayor comes and tests the alcohol. They do it literally every year, once a year. So little things like that. We couldn't afford lots of location. I mean, it cost £2.5 million, and we shot it in 25 days because that's all we could afford. And that, you know, I've always done things on small budgets, so that's never a problem. I would have liked the tube to have been really full, but I couldn't afford it. And if you can't afford it, you know, end off. There's no point in, you know, fretting about it. But because most of the action takes place really actually in that flat. But if you're going to just shoot what is written in a play, then there's no point. There's just no point in photographing a play, ever. Who wants to watch a filmed play? There are two exceptions, though. In 1952, Anthony Asquith shot The Importance of Being Earnest, and the only reason you look at it is because the performances are fabulous, absolutely fabulous, but particularly from Joan Greenwood and Edith Evans. Do you have any reservations at all? She says, I have the gravest reservations, but I intend to crush them.
What's the other?
Oh, the man who came to dinner. For Monty Woolley's performance, alone, and the wonderful Mary Wicks. Oh, as Miss Preen. She says, you're eating too much candy. He says to her, Miss Preen, I had an Aunt Jennifer who ate a box of candy every day of her life. She lived to be 104, and after she'd been dead for 3 days, she looked better than you do now.
I get the impression from your films that you're going back to the theme of love, that you have this sort of love affair with England, perhaps in England that doesn't exist. So they feel very elegiac, your films. Can you say something about that? Or that doesn't exist anymore? England that has gone.
No, I suppose I do love my country. I'm its severest critic, because I think we're imploding. I think we're the most uncivilized nation in Europe. You know, go to any Spanish resort that the British have taken over, unbearable. I mean, we really are imploding. But that doesn't mean to say I don't love it. What really angers me is when we're not allowed to say what we've achieved. Any other country would be proud of our cultural achievement. We invented the novel. Our poetry is second to none, so is the theatre. We produced the greatest novelist, the greatest playwright. For a small island, that's not bad. You say that in England, and you're called elitist. I hate that. I hate the caste system, which is still there, particularly the royal family, who are utter parasites. And the sooner we get rid of them, the better. But the caste system is still there, and I do hate that, because all my working class hackles rise. We showed the film in Cambridge, in England. And after the Q&A, this lady came up to me, and said, can I ask you about the scenes with Mother? And I said, of course. She said, did Hester deliberately eat her soup the wrong way? I said, I'm sorry, I didn't realise there was a right or wrong way to eat soup. Apparently there is. When you eat soup, you tilt the plate forward and you spoon it like this. Pudding is the other way. Could you care less? No. But there's always some nutter that's in the audience. You can't get away from that. But what I do abhor is, and I really abhor this, is the way we disregard our language. We have one of the most beautiful languages in the world, one of the most expressive languages. And to hear people saying, it's sort of like and stuff, it makes your heart sink. You know, I mean, there was an article in one of the papers before I left to come here. This girl had written for a job, and she had started her letter like this. OMG, this sounds like a really interesting sort of job and stuff. Funnily enough, she didn't get it. And that's awful. We're the only country in the world that despises our own language. You know, any other language wouldn't do it. Because, of course, it's a hybrid, it's a mongrel. And we have lots of rules, but thousands of exceptions to them, typically English. But I hate that because I love good English. When you hear good English, it's just sublime. You know, you read, you know, any of the great novelists, read any of the great poetry. And your poets as well. Emily Dickinson is your greatest poet. I mean, look at her work, the wonderful use of English.
Well, I'm English, actually, so...
I'm sorry?
I'm English, so she's not one of my poets.
Do you have any memory of the wreckage that you saw during your childhood in England, and how does that translate, especially with the final shot?
Well, where I grew up in the 50s. I was born 45, so I knew what it was like, but what it felt like, and it felt, if you don't know what it's felt like, you can't recreate the period. You know, there was nothing. Literally, we were bankrupt. And in fact, when at the beginning of Tony Blair's premiership, we just finished paying off our debt to your country. It took that long to pay off. So I knew what it was like. Everything was shabby. Everything was shabby. Everything was threadbare. But you actually had to make the best of it. You know, and people did. No primary colour, except in possibly you might see some primary colour at school, but no, not in real life. So that when she's dressed in this claret coat, of course she looks ravishing, you know, because, you know, she stands out, and she's meant to. But it's the feel. I know what it felt like of light falling on embossed wallpaper down a hall and liner. I know it's because I was sitting in our house most of the time. So I know what it felt like, and you've got to try and recall its feeling, and that's really, really hard to do. But I had long discussions with the DOP, the person who costumed it and who designed it, and we did a lot of tests, and we just ran them. And I said, that's the one, that's the look. And of course it was 35mm film, although digital will take over in the next 5 years. But once you discuss with the heads of department what the look is, and you find it in the tests, then that's what you just do. I was interested in pools of light, because that's what I remember. I mean, most people had only light in their front room, the parlour as it was called. Some even had only gas, which gave a kind of green colour to it. But coming home from school, for instance, in September, it was always dark. And I'd go into the front room, my mother had lit the fire, and with some toasted potato cakes on the hearth with a pot of tea, and all the room was reflected in the firelight. And that room seemed sumptuous to me. And we had nothing, it was just old furniture that she just polished all the time. And even though the colour palette is actually narrow, it doesn't mean to say that it can't be rich within that narrowness. And that's what that's what was so achieved by my my team. I couldn't have done it without them. I could not have done it without them. It's our film, it's not mine, it's ours. And I'm proud of every one of them. I really am just so proud of them. And what's extraordinary is that the kind of response it's had. I mean, it was made for the most modest of budgets and with the most modest of intentions. I can tell you, never did I think I'd be travelling around America talking about it. I would think, well, why would anyone be interested, you know, in Britain in 1952, you know, because no one's interested in it now.